Hey guys, welcome to Sela Social Studies.
Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Today we're going to be covering the first president's response to the Great Depression. Who is president during the Great Depression? We actually wind up having two, but who's the first and what's their response and how come they couldn't get us out of the Great Depression? Well, the first president who kind of had the Great Depression fall into their lap was Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover is elected president during the 1920s. So during the Roaring 20s, Hoover becomes president. He thinks everything's going well. A lot of the country thinks that a lot of things are going well. He kind of continues Coolidge's pro-business plan into the late 1920s, early 1930s. He thinks that laissez-faire, that hands-off business, government control, make sure the government's hands are off business. He thinks that that's a good thing. I mean, because of this laissez-faire, hands-off, businesses were really starting to boom. He wanted to keep the isolationism. Things were going well. So he continues this return to normalcy from Coolidge of isolationism and laissez-faire. But is that good enough? No. Because of the whole idea of this laissez-faire type government, businesses were able to expand, we'll call it, beyond their means. People were buying stock left and right on margin. Businesses were just producing, mass consumption. Everything is going well until that stock market crash. So during Hoover's term, the stock market crashes and things start going bad for him. Does Hoover plan to help the government? As this video being made right now is actually during the COVID-19 crisis of 2020. So what happens today? The president, Congress has just passed a $2 trillion stimulus plan to try to help the economy back out. Why are they doing this? They're doing this because we've learned from our history. Herbert Hoover did not believe in government intervention during the crisis. He believed that this depression will eventually end. Americans need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. They need to go to churches and they need to go to private individuals to try to help get things going again. So we learn now that that is the wrong approach. During something like the Depression, the government has to step in and help. However, Hoover does sign something called the Hawley-Smoot Tariff. Now, what does the Hawley-Smoot Tariff do? Well, investors are really starting to get on Hoover, and they're like, listen, you need to do something to try to protect us. Our businesses are failing. So the first thing he does is he signs this tariff, and what this tariff does is it protects it's designed to protect U.S. industry from overseas competition, which eventually pretty much makes trading come to a complete halt in the United States. And in 1932, Hoover goes along with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And what this does is this allocates about $500 million to banks, to businesses, and it's just loans to state government, stuff like that, to be able to try to help save some of these businesses that are going under during the Depression. So originally, Hoover says no, he's not going to help, but he does start folding under pressure and does start to try to do a little bit of good for the country. $500 million is a lot of money in the 1920s. So now in the 1930s. So now you're talking about what we have today during the COVID-19 crisis is $2 trillion to Hoover's $500 billion in 1932. So Hoover tries this new type of economics, which we call like a trickle-down economics. The idea behind trickle-down economics is Hoover was going to cut the taxes for the ultra-wealthy and the businesses. the idea behind this is that it would trickle down. If the companies and the rich got these big, massive tax cuts, then the theory is that they would then take that money from those tax cuts and they would do things like expand business, hire new people for jobs. And once you do that, so big tax cut, you create a new part of your business. You're able to hire, 500 new people. Now you can pay these 500 new people. Those 500 new people would then go to the store and they would buy groceries. You have this trickles down, and then those farmers that produce that food would then go ahead and get money as well. So the money would trickle down from the rich up top, and it would trickle down all the way to the person who was creating the goods. However, did not work. Trickle-down economics sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. This is one of those times that trickle down doesn't work. The problem is those wealthy that gets the tax cuts, if they don't do what they're supposed to do by creating new jobs and opportunities to trickle this money down, and they put it in their pockets, how does that make it trickle down? It stays up at the top. So Hoover tries to get people back to work. He does put people back to work in the public's work sector. And what this means is people start building things like the Golden Gate Bridge, water aqueducts, and actually a very popular tourist attraction that we have today, which bears Hoover's name, the Hoover Dam, is built from Hoover trying to put people back to work. Roosevelt will use this idea later, and he will put a lot of people, millions of people, back to work doing things like public works. So how are Americans getting affected by this? Well, to show you how Americans felt about Hoover, what would happen is when Americans lost their homes because they didn't have any money to pay their bills, they would all move to the outskirts of these cities and they would build these shanty towns called Hoovervilles. And what these Hoovervilles were literally, you could call it houses, but they were made up of things like cardboard, scrap pieces of wood, doors off of buildings. They would have, windows would just be cut out. It would have dirt floors, and they called them Hoovervilles in the insult to President Hoover. Now, this was terrible. There are sources, and you read things that say that people were eating garbage out of trash cans. I read a source one time that a lady said that she would not cut or cook her meat with her glasses on because with her glasses on, she could see the maggots in the meat. So this is how poor Americans were at the time. Now remember, it's not all Americans. Not every American was affected poorly like this, but a lot of them were. So one of these Hoovervilles that is created by something what we call the bonus army. And what is the bonus army? The bonus army set up a Hooverville across the Capitol across the Potomac River in response to the fact that they were not getting paid their bonuses. That's why it's called the bonus army. Now, who are they? The bonus army is a group of World War I veterans. These people who fought in the war were promised a $1,000 bonus for their time service in the war. Well, when the payment comes due, like, hey, we're ready to get our $1,000 checks, Congress is like, no, you're not going to get it. Well, first of all, they're like, we're in this depression, so we're not going to give you the money. This group of veterans that we call the bonus army protest daily to try to get their $1,000 payments sent to them. Unfortunately for them, it does not pass Congress at all. President Hoover does not agree with it. And ultimately, this bonus army kind of sizzles out and fades away, where some of them go back home. Now, some of them do stay, but still the bonus army does not get those checks that they were promised for serving in World War I. So an election is coming up now. Now we're going into the second president about who's going to deal with the Great Depression. In 1932, President Hoover runs against a man called Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And Roosevelt promises the Americans a new deal. He thinks that their deal that Hoover's given them is kind of cruddy. So Hoover fails at dealing with the Great Depression. Will Roosevelt fail? Find out next time.